Camera's rolling. And they say filmmaking isn't glamorous. So I, like many people, have been in somewhat of a lockdown for the last couple months. Production has basically hit the brakes completely. So I decided, since I basically run a production company out of my house, I should probably use this time to make a film. I mean, I've got cameras, lenses, lights, an editing rig. There's really nothing stopping me besides the fact that I have no crew to work with besides my wife. I'm not really a cinematographer or a VFX artist, and I can really only shoot in my house, which I told myself I wouldn't do anymore because I've kind of shot out this space. But what did I have to lose? I mean, the worst case scenario is I make a film that's complete and utter shit and I never release it. So there's really zero stakes. So I decided to make a little horror film. And my wife, Melissa, who's decidedly not an on-camera actor, starred in it, so thanks, babe. There were two reasons I wanted to do a horror film. The first being that I'd never done one before, and I wanted to see if I could pull it off. Most of my stuff in the past has been either dark comedies...
See you in hell, motherfucker.
We've decided to start doing heroin!
...or dramas.
Found a toe.
Found a what?
But I've never tackled any sort of suspense or thriller or horror film before. The second reason, you can often do them pretty cheap. You can rely on things like sound effects and music to up the tension and creep factor, which helps keep costs basically zero. So I wrote a little horror piece that takes place entirely in the bedroom, did a few lighting tests and blocking a couple nights before our proper production, and then off we went. And then look in the closet. When you start hearing like dun 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 dun, that's when you cover your head. Okay. Also, as I mentioned, I'm not a cinematographer, so this was the first time I DP'd something that I was also directing since, well, this. We shot over 3 nights for a couple hours each night before Melissa inevitably began falling asleep.
Okay, I'll take a nap. For the bloopers.
Then during the days, I'd close the windows, relight, and shoot some inserts and close-ups that didn't necessarily require Melissa to be there. But sometimes that backfired. Like when she wasn't home and I set everything up to shoot the door hitting the chest, only to realize that I can't phase through the walls and get myself in the closet with the chest in front of the door. So I improvised. And since I don't have a low tripod or baby legs or a pancake or anything like that, I literally rested the camera on top of a couple books to get the right angle. I shot the film on my Canon C300 Mark II, which actually was kind of a pain in the ass. I got it. Like, I love this camera. It's my baby. I've run and gunned client shoots and short-form documentaries for clients with it as a one-man band. But it's one thing to one-man band it when you're in an uncontrolled environment and just trying to pick up good moments. It's another when you're crammed into a small bedroom trying to operate it, direct, and pull focus all at once.
Action. Fuck, I pulled too far. One more. Sorry, that sucked. That for me. Make it a hand of this.
Yeah.
The footage came out great, and I'm glad I used it instead of my Sony A7S Mark II, but form factor wise, for this kind of project, a smaller camera would have definitely been more efficient. The thing is, I also really wanted to use my 18-35 f1.8 art lens, but that wouldn't work in 4K on my Sony A7S Mark II since it's designed for APS-C sensors. I think if I used a smaller camera, we probably could have gotten away with shooting it all in 2 nights instead of 3, because there would have just been a lot less fighting with the camera's size. Like, wedging myself into the closet for this shot was really tight. And then when we did this one, I mashed myself into the corner, and it was just overall uncomfortable.
In the closet they go. Okay, good. Take this. And... Oh, man. Oh, my legs.
Babe, help.
Oh, that's okay.
And for this shot, I had to lay on my back, put the camera on my chest, and hold my breath throughout every take.
One more, slower.
Okay. I feel bad because you're holding your breath.
It's okay.
Okay.
Don't rush for me.
Okay.
Action.
So sometimes a bigger camera doesn't necessarily mean a better camera. Lenses-wise, I'd say 80% of the film was shot on the aforementioned Sigma 18-35 art lens. It's my favorite lens that I have. It's versatile as all hell and super sharp and faster than 2.8 zoom lenses. Then the other 20% of the film, I used my Rokinon Cine DS lenses, primarily the 50mm t1.5. I also did a few shots with the 85mm, and I think a single shot of Melissa's eye was on the 100mm t3.1 macro lens. And then lastly, there were a few wides on my Laowa 15mm f4 macro lens. Then with lighting, I kept it pretty simple. As I mentioned, I'm not really a cinematographer. I debated using my Aperture C120D, but with the light dome, I felt like it would be too big for the space. Plus, it's the Mark I, it's only daylight, and I needed to shoot a bunch of the film with tungsten lighting. So I used this Moss LED work light, since it's got a few different color temperature settings, including 2700 Kelvin, which matched the lamp on the side table. I bounced it into the ceiling to expose the room. Then I had one of these Yongnuo light wands with my Aperture diffuser gaff taped around it, bouncing off a wall. And then these little Aperture AL M9s gaff taped the wall, the blinds, the curtains, microphone stands, basically wherever I needed to get a little bit of an extra kicker. They're only one color, but I had a few gels to warm them up a bit to try to match the tungsten look. The problem with our bedroom, though, is that it's beige, so it's basically a giant bounce card. It didn't leave me with a lot of natural shadows. I probably should have taped some cardboard to the work light for some fake barn doors, but hindsight's always 20/20. Then for the lights off scene, I changed the work light settings to 5600 Kelvin, and I put the Aperture ALM9s lower to emulate window light from the moon or a street light. And for some of the door inserts, I literally taped it to a plastic bin we had just to give it some blinds-like shadows. Then when I picture locked it, I threw in that way blue look, crushed down the shadows and blacks, and faked that sort of nighttime look. You'll notice that the raw footage is really bright, which is because I shot it at a proper exposure and then brought the exposure down in color grading, almost treating it as a day for night type shoot. It's much harder to recover a darker in-camera image if you underexpose, because then you run the risk of noisy or grainy footage. And since I'm not a cinematographer, I didn't really trust my abilities to shoot an underexposed image. And for the tungsten light scene, I basically created false shadows in DaVinci Resolve around the room, brought the exposure down, and enhanced the light on her face to give it a bit more contrast. I mean, if you pay attention, some of those shadows are really obviously fake, but I feel like unless you're looking for it, it might not be something you would notice. We did a few reshoots throughout the nights. For example, this handheld walking shot of Melissa to the closet. Originally, I had her more rise into the frame and then start walking, because I kind of had this idea that she's literally rising up to symbolize her sort of curious bravery. But then when I cut it into the film, it looked weird. So we reshot it the following night with me following her move standing up. And for this shot where she looks down at the chest, we originally just had her stand there and look, but it cut super weird with her previous reaction to the open closet. And down to the chest. So we just reshot it with her turning around to face the closet. I felt it was a bit more natural this way. And that's the benefit of being the sole crew member and shooting a film in your home. You can reshoot the shots you screw up with zero pressure. Now for sound, throughout production, we rolled on a shotgun mic that was connected to the C300. It's part of our kit for that camera. But I had to talk Melissa through a lot of the actions and timing. Face. So we went back after I'd finished the near final edit and started to do a whole bunch of Foley work in the bedroom with my Rode NTG4 Plus and my Zoom H4n. Pull the things up and like hit your chest a bit, because you kind of like pull that up with a little bit of force. Yeah. We'd watch the clips, figure out the timing, and then reenact them while watching it on my laptop to try to match the sound and get just a cleaner feed than what was picked up in production. A lot of the noises the monster made are just pieces of styrofoam rubbing together and cracking. I edited the film in Premiere and did VFX and After Effects. I colored the film in DaVinci Resolve and continually bothered my cinematographer friends by sending them stills to see what they thought of my lighting and my color correction abilities. As I mentioned before, I'm definitely not a VFX artist, but I know how to shoot for VFX, which is something I learned a lot about when I did my Zelda film back in 2014. So I made sure to shoot the VFX shots in a manner I knew I could handle. I did all the tracking in After Effects. I tried to use as much automated tracking as possible, but ended up having to sort of keyframe everything frame by frame. Luckily, I kept the shots short, so it wasn't as painful as it could have been. It's actually Melissa's hand in these close-ups and then my hand in the wide shot the following day, because we didn't pick it up with her that night. Fun fact, her pinky doing this little retraction thing, That was actually completely accidental and involuntary. She just went for a take and her finger cracked, and I loved it. I thought it added a certain creepy, inhuman movement to that moment.
Go. I love it.
So to enhance that, I took a single frame from one of the other takes and cropped it in a few frames before that. So it seems like her hand does this unnatural crack back and forth, and then I enhanced it with sound effects. So it was one of those moments that basically a happy accident ended up motivating a huge part of this film. Actually, you know what? Forget everything I just said. I'm a filmmaker, so it was 100% intentional, and we actually did 500 takes to get that finger crack just right. And for the mirror shot, we shot a plate of her reacting
And face.
a plate of me poking my head in, and then composited them over one another and timed it appropriately. Then I color graded it, added some white creepy eyes and a loud noise, and boom! Because it's not a horror without a jump scare. And for this gag, I simply hit a cut in the whip pan. In the second shot, Melissa is in the closet and pushing that door open just a little bit. Not exactly revolutionary filmmaking, but it's effective and it worked. When I say go, just a little motion. So it just seems like it's still just opening.
Okay.
Like, so even if it's like boom, that. Cool, you ready? All right, and 3, 2, 1, go. That was sick. And for the monster, I really had no idea what I wanted or what I could pull off. I was kind of inspired by this Halloween mask picture I saw while trying to research scary monsters and wanted something kind of similar. This shot of me is actually from our camera tests. I figured I'd shoot it and test the VFX on it, but then I settled on that kind of lighting and color style anyway and figured there was no need to reshoot it. I replaced my mouth with a texture of raw meat and added dark spots similar to the gaps in the mask's mouth. I added some color and layering effects, and then I used a macro shot I previously picked up of a swarm of ants crawling and brought down the opacity and layered it over to make it seem like the mouth was even more alive. I tracked and masked out my eyes, layered a royalty-free image of mud over my skin, and took the nose from a royalty-free picture of a skull and applied it to my face. After that, I tracked everything to my head's movement in After Effects. Then I lit the eyes up using Video Copilot's optical flares plugin. I cut the shot to only be 1 second and 4 frames. I felt like it was long enough to take in what you saw, possibly scare the audience, but short enough to not notice the many imperfections, especially on a first watch. Plus, the dark color correction helps hide the problems. The tracking of the skin textures gets a little wonky if you pay attention. The mouth tracking kind of floats a little bit, but overall I was kind of surprised at my ability to pull it off. Again, knowing my lack of VFX abilities, I made sure to lean into what I knew was possible, but also a little tougher than what I'd done in the past just to push my own limits.
Okay, cut.
If the Stark Gauntlet can clip in Thanos' hand in the biggest movie ever made, I figure the skin textures in my tiny little 2-person horror film are good enough. Basically, nothing will ever be perfect, and that's okay. For music, I initially went through the film and added some drones and pieces of music from artlist.io since I have an account with them. But I kind of wanted to push my limits and see if I could compose my own music, which is something I'd never done for one of my films before. I'm a drummer and played in a band for many years. I can kinda strum a guitar, but in terms of my musical performance abilities, I am basically just a drummer. If it's not something I smack with sticks, I'm not very good at it. I do own a violin, however, that I got as a wedding present, so I figured I'd put it to good use. I know how to make horrible noises with it, and thought, that's perfect for a horror film. Unfortunately for Melissa, she had to hear a lot of this. Then I bought a MIDI keyboard and recorded my own drones and simple melodies with Pro Tools First, the very basic, free version of Pro Tools. I'm not a pianist, but I have enough of an understanding of instrumentation that I can keep things on key and record long notes. However, it had been a couple years since I played with Pro Tools, so that was a little bit of a learning curve. And speaking of Pro Tools, the only thing I didn't do myself was the final sound mix. A friend who I work with a lot on client projects named Murray Fleming offered to help me out. And as someone who thinks that sound is more important than visuals when it comes to film, it's kind of hard to turn that down. I'd done a huge amount of sound design and mixing myself while working through the edit, but Murray was able to just take it to that next level. Now, if you don't have access to a sound mixer or a post-audio person, you can do it yourself. If I did the sound mix myself, it probably would have been fine. But like most aspects of filmmaking, there's always someone who can do a certain task better than you. The whole film would probably have been better if I could have someone just handle cinematography or just handle visual effects. But knowing how to do those things at least a base level will help you even more when working with the pros. It'll allow you to speak their language and communicate your vision with them as a director and ultimately end up with a better project. Now, if you for some reason watched this before watching the film, the link is in the description. I also created an alternate cut of the film with sort of a pop-up video format showing some of the corresponding behind-the-scenes clips and text throughout. It's also in the description, so check it out there. Anyway, that's sort of a rundown on how all of this came together. The thing is to remember that you don't need the gear I have to make a film. All you need to do is be creative and be patient.
More.
All this gear has been accumulated over the past 7 years of working as a professional producer, director, and editor. You could definitely do something similar to this with cheaper lenses or cheaper cameras or less lights. There are films out there that were produced with much cheaper gear. If you don't have a high-end camera, use a DSLR. If you don't have a DSLR, use a phone. Basically, just go out, use what you got, and make a film.